Chapter 7, A Peaceful Deal where Wolfe fought Montcalm. This chapter is named for the fact that the room where all of the Feathers of Confederation met is in fact perched on the same cliffs where General James Wolfe fought the Marquis de Montcalm at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, thus winning the Battle of Quebec for the British in 1759. This is just a little over a century before the Quebec Conference of 1864. The Fenians were essentially the predecessors of the Irish Republican Army, or the IRA, who were based in North America. So in short, the Fenians were fighting for Irish independence from Great Britain, or at the very least, some sort of home rule from Dublin. The Fenians arose out of a group called the Irish Republican Brotherhood in Ireland, who in turn came around a short-lived group called Young Ireland. This group at one time included Thomas D'Arcy Magee, who was now father of Confederation and a leading Canadian politician and a journalist. Magee turned his back on violence to get Irish independence, and he favored a peaceful, democratic, and non-violent approach toward home rule. He believed that violence only made the situation more repressive in Ireland, as it would force the British, who ruled all of Ireland at that time, to become even more repressive to the native Irish, Gaelic-speaking, Celtic-cultured Roman Catholic population. This is how he saw his own native Irish people as being, although this was rather an idealized view of the world at that time. In truth, it was a lot of romantic nonsense, at least on his own part. Anyway, the most important thing to remember of Magee is that when the Fenians attacked British North America from the United States, he was solely responsible for uniting millions of Irish people under the threat of Fenians. He did not advocate taking up arms against the invading Fenians, as he thought the Canadian militia and the British Army would take care of any actual armed attack anywhere in British North America. But Magee was critical in preventing the Fenians from killing large numbers of people in British North America, as they had done in the US. This was, as a result, put him on the top of the Fenians assassination list. He would indeed be assassinated, but not by the Fenians. The man who killed him in 1868 was Joseph Patrick Whalen, who everyone assumed to be a member of the Fenians, or an anarchist or a political radical. But in reality, Whalen was a mentally insane man who had somehow gotten escaped from an insane asylum in Quebec City. He was also the last person to be publicly hanged in Canada. This was because Prime Minister John Macdonald wanted a public example made of Whalen for shooting and killing Magee. Nonetheless, there were no calls for revenge of any kind when Magee was laid to rest. In fact, Magee's own funeral became a uniting place for the different peoples of Canada: Irish, French, Canadian, British, and Loyalist. The story of the Fenians needs a little bit more explaining, as they are rarely mentioned in Canadian history. Basically, the Fenians were a North American branch of the Irish Republican Brotherhood in Ireland. The Irish Republican Brotherhood were more extreme than the other version of Irish independence organization called Young Ireland, which was short-lived. The British declared martial law over the whole island of Ireland in 1860. As a result, the Irish independence movement basically collapsed upon itself. This collapse resulted in the creation of Young Ireland and the Irish Republican Brotherhood. But convinced that the fighting had already started, the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, the same as the Governor General is in Canada, put the whole of Ireland under martial law, and Young Ireland just died out shortly thereafter. As for the Irish Republican Brotherhood, they started to rise up and begin a rebellion that was quickly crushed. The British government was very quick to react to that rebellion, which lasted about 6 weeks or so, and it ended in failure. The reason for the rebellion's failure was that the Irish Republican Brotherhood were just too radical for anybody, and too badly equipped and poorly drilled as well. The Irish Republican Brotherhood was succeeded by the equally radical Sinn Féin movement, which eventually turned into the IRA. As for the Young Ireland movement, it turned into Fianna Fáil. Why is that all important to Canadian Confederation? Well, in Canada, we have never had anything close to a civil war or a revolution, so it is mostly a contrast rather than compare Canada to either Ireland or the US. For example, Ireland has all kinds of different revolts in their long and bloody history for independence. Canada basically got its independence peaceful negotiation with the British government over time before both Confederation in 1867 and since then as well. Nor has Canada ever experienced the horrors of a civil war like the Americans have. So, in spite of Canada having an English majority overall, with a French minority mainly in Quebec and New Brunswick, and despite divisions over language, we have never resorted to taking up arms against each other on linguistic divides. Here in Canada, we have maintained a rather workable system most of the time. As Georges Cartier once said, now it is no wonder that the French are following political affairs in Canada with such interest, for they cannot believe that we have undergone a major political revolution without spilling any blood, which they have done so prodigiously. Now let us turn our attention back to the Fenians and their raids in Upper Canada and Lower Canada, in New Brunswick as well. Although the Fenians never numbered more than a few 100,000, they bragged of openly capturing the whole of Canada to hold until Britain gave complete independence to the whole island of Ireland. As the Fenian song put it, quote, "We are the Fenian Brotherhood. We fought many a great battle, the boys in the blue and the grey, but today we're off to conquer Canada, for we have nothing else to do." Indeed, most of these Fenians were radicalized Irish immigrants and veterans of the American Civil War. In fact, a lot of them were former Confederate soldiers who would fight alongside former Union soldiers in order to liberate Ireland from the British by capturing Canada. However, the Fenians had a problem, which would eventually lead to their downfall. They had a civilian man as head of military enterprise, yet he was more radical than most people could stand. Their top general was a former American cavalry general who was also of Irish ancestry. This general was more of an administrative man than he was a soldier. So not surprisingly, these two men fell out and eventually fought a duel. Eventually, 99% of the Fenians sided with the general over the civilian leader, and this split was fatal for the Fenian movement, as it meant the Fenians were now more of an incoherent rabble of rebels than any legitimate military organization. It meant, in the simplest terms, the Fenians were more of a psychological threat than a military one. Even so, Britain had sent 66,000 extra soldiers to Canada, and volunteers turned out in huge droves for the local Canadian militia divisions, which were well organized by county and by city. For example, if someone with the City of St. John limits, they were expected to turn out when called up and serve with the City of St. John militia. But if someone was outside the city limits, then they would be expected to turn out for the St. John County militia. Each city and county militia in New Brunswick, or any other colony, was expected to turn out when they were called up by county and city by the Queen's representative, the Lieutenant Governor, who was also their commander-in-chief of the colony's defence forces. It was also important to note that the Lieutenant Governor's orders to order out and call up the militia could, however, be superseded by the Governor General of Canada, who usually stayed in Quebec City, Lower Canada. When Britain sent 66,000 soldiers to Canada, they joined the already 600,000 soldiers here. The problem was that all the British forces were stationed in either Halifax or Quebec City. Every other town, city, county, and settlement of any kind had to rely on their local Canadian militia. Each Canadian militia always had a colonel in charge of it. These colonels were very often from well-to-do local families. Each county and city colonel who had the power, at least locally, to call up and order out the local militia for a few months in the summer for their annual training. This always consisted of drill, discipline, gunnery practice, target practice, and marching long distances with their full equipment on at all times. It was this force that was expected to put up a proper defence of each colony until British regulars arrived from Halifax or Quebec City. These militias were expected to hold off the Fenians until the British regulars could arrive to drive them back across the border again. In Upper Canada, John A. Macdonald had an idea. This was to push his case for an intercolonial railway, which eventually stretched into a pan-Canadian transcontinental railroad system. This railroad could be used to rush the British Army and Canadian militia to any trouble spots along the border. John A. Macdonald, like a lot of the other fathers of the Confederation, had once been in the militia in their respective colonies, but many were now too old for militia training. The militia training often stopped at the age of 50 or 60, depending on the colony itself, as different colonial legislatures had different rules and regulations for their militias. During the American Civil War, John A. Macdonald had come up with the idea of what was called the railway militia. He was essentially a permanent force drawn from each county and city in Upper and Lower Canada that was put onto a specially designed armored train and sent along the railway lines looking for potential trouble spots. It could also be sent to any place in Upper and Lower Canada if there was an invasion or rebellion of some sort. The railway militiamen were dressed in red coats, as if they were regular British soldiers, and they were even trained by British regulars. In addition, the railway militia had access to the latest Gatling guns and also the latest rifled artillery, as well as the latest rifled guns and revolvers. In fact, the Royal Militia was as close to a functional army as the Canadian government could manage at the time. This was why the militia was formed in the early 1860s under the Railway Militia Act. This was basically because a permanent standing Canadian army of well-equipped, well-drilled, well-trained men and a more disciplined version of Canadian militia at the time was the closest that this could become. Even though it was commanded by British regular army officers, it was basically a Canadian army because it still had a colonel in charge of each part of the county or city militia. Unfortunately, this so-called Royal Militia was abandoned after 1865 as it was too expensive to operate and the immediate danger of an American invasion had gone away. Besides that, the British Army was reducing its forces and downsizing, and even abandoned different Canadian military forts and other posts in an effort to concentrate more on the other theatres of operation around the world, of which Canada was the least important. That is until the Fenians came on the scene in about 1865 or 1866. This caused the British to reinforce its garrisons in British North America, as well as to deal with the new Fenian threat. Both John A. Macdonald and George Tencarche saw this as a chance to argue with the other that some kind of union would never be vulnerable to outside attack, either from the Americans or any other internal rebellions. This persuaded pretty much all the delegates that some kind of confederation was needed to unite the colonies into one, at least militarily speaking. In New Brunswick, the governor was also the commander-in-chief, and his name is Arthur Gordon. He responded to the Fenian threat by ordering out the militia and even calling a the British Army to help strengthen the colonial's defences along the American border. This deterrent proved highly successful. The Fenians never attacked across the border. However, they did destroy a few houses on some partly inhabited islands in the St. Andrews and St. Stephen areas. The fact that the invasion response network proved so successful that it worked exactly as planned when it was tested, however by accident. This accident occurred when a fisherman was hauling in his nets when someone mistook him for a Fenian. So the local county sheriff took off running on his horse, shouting, quote, "Arm yourselves, the Fenians are upon you." This set off an alarm in St. Andrews, so someone was sent to get to St. Stephen and St. George, and within an hour the whole New Brunswick militia was out in full force locally, ready to respond to the Fenian attack. Unfortunately, there was no attack. It was simply a fisherman hauling his nets at night, but by the time word got around it was a false alarm, the whole New Brunswick was on high alert. Even a regular British Army was being deployed from Halifax, Nova Scotia to the New Brunswick main border, and had to be stopped in the town of Moncton, New Brunswick, and sent back to Halifax by train. In any case, the Fenians only fired a few shots by their rifles across the St. Croix River, which marks the Canada-US border in the town of St. Stephen, New Brunswick, but nothing more than that ever came of the Fenian threat in New Brunswick. In Lower Canada, the Fenians expect to get support from the French Canadians and a large amount of Irish inhabitants of that country. Instead, they found no support at all. The French Canadians viewed the Fenians as a rabble-rousing bunch of rebels and renegades, so they stood aloof from the Fenians, who had refused to do anything to do with them. The Irish didn't give their support to their fellow Irishmen at all. In fact, there were hundreds of thousands of Irish immigrants willing to fight for Canada instead of against it, but the majority of Irish were indifferent to the Fenians and their movement for Irish independence. Most of them didn't really care what happened back home in Ireland, as Canada had become their home now. In fact, some Irish families in their second generation on Canadian soil, which would have been for many their first Canadian-born generation. The reason the Fenians did not get support in British North America in general is because Thomas D'Arcy Magee and his very popular newspaper, which printed in Irish, Gaelic, and English. It was also put out a French newspaper, in a Scottish Gaelic newspaper as well as a Welsh newspaper, but it's because of him that the majority of people did not support the Fenians when they attacked from 1865 to 1871. The Fenian movement was thus declared illegal in the United States in 1871, bringing them to an end. In Upper Canada, the Fenians actually attacked and achieved some surprising victories at the Battle of Ridgeway and the Battle of Eaker's Hill, both on the Niagara frontier. The Battle of Ridgeway ended with the Fenians capturing a few towns and some smaller settlements and the cutting of a few telegraph lines. They were also victorious in the Battle of Ridgeway, as the Canadian militia had panicked and ran away. They then thought British regulars were coming, so they ran back across the American border and surrendered to the U.S. Army. Both sides ran away, which meant both sides looked equally ridiculous to the other at least. But it was their first victory since the 1798 rebellion.